Hello, my name is Matt. Welcome to Unbearable 73. There are a lot of things to complain about in Amazoff's upcoming fanfiction show, Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. Whether it's the insertion of Marxist ideology in the reinterpretation and deconstruction of the lore, or the apparent teen drama elements being inserted, or the Game of Thrones sexing up that seems to be occurring, or the likely horrific writing which my friend Salty Texas has pointed out in several live streams. The long and short event is that there's a lot of bad stuff being smooshed into this food processor, and just grinding it into gray, homogeneous mush is not going to make it any more palatable to you or me. To me, my biggest concern has been the compressed timeline that they've stated that they're going to be using. So based on what we've gleaned from the casting, the teaser, some still shot releases, and some tweets and whatnot, I'm going to try to establish what the time period is in the canon, and then later we'll talk about whether it's even feasible to compress it the way they claim they want to. So first I want to establish the timeline of some events from the actual canon. And bear with me, I will try to make this as entertaining as I can, but this will take 5 to 10 minutes. The First Age is a time period from the beginning of the universe to the end of the War of Wrath. Tolkien never provides a precise chronology of the First Age. It is, however, important to note that the entirety of the First Age takes place before the Second Age. Now, this may have sounded patronizing, but needs to be said because Amazoff, in their fanfiction, is deliberately compressing and manipulating the timeline. Most of the datable events in the First Age happen in the last 500 to 1,000 years of that time period. These events are the return of the Noldor en masse to Middle-earth and their series of wars against Morgoth. Prior to those events, there are several chronologies which Tolkien establishes, all which conclude before the Noldor return to Middle-earth. The years given for the First Age are only about 580 or so, because they were established when the Noldor returned to Middle-earth. Prior to that, for example, Galadriel is born in YT 1362. YT means Years of the Trees, which is the time period before the Years of the Sun. The Years of the Sun is the time period that began when the Valar created the sun and continues to the present day. It includes the end of the First Age, the Second Age, the Third Age, the Fourth Age of Man, and in Tolkien's chronology, we will be living in the Sixth or Seventh Age. It includes all of that. Galadriel meets Celebrimbor after she returns with the second host of the Noldor, led by Finarfin, to Middle-earth. They meet in Doriath, where Celebrimbor was a prince and nephew of the king. This means that she's married before the end of the First Age. Elrond and Elros, twins, are born to Eärendil and Elwing 500 years after the Noldor returned to Middle-earth, in approximately 500 for FA 500. At the end of the First Age, the War of Wrath occurs, when upon hearing the plea of Eärendil and Elwing, the Valar send the hosts of the Valar to Middle-earth to defeat Morgoth's forces once and for all. Morgoth is defeated and cast out through the door of the night into the void outside Ea about 3 years after the end of the War of Wrath. The Second Age begins at the end of the War of Wrath and with the raising of the Isle of Elena from the ocean floor by Ulmo, closer to Aman than to Middle-earth. If one were to sail westward from Elena, one cannot see the Undying Land so long as Elena remains in your sight when looking back to the east. The land was eventually to be given to the world-weary Edain, those mortal men who were elf friends and fought with the elves against the forces of Morgoth. The Edain were notably long-lived, even prior to the reward of the Valar, living for 90 to 100 years before the gift of Elena, and gaining lifespans of several hundred years after they settled on Numenor. They had exceptional health and vitality and were taller than other men. The term Dunedain refers to men descended from those who settled on Numenor and later colonized Middle-earth. This is in about the 585th year of the Noldor's return to Middle-earth, 590th year, that the Second Age begins. Just again, place it in context. So, critical events of the Second Age. Second Age 32. The Edain followed the Star of Eärendil to Elena, led by Elros, half-elven, who had made the choice of the half-elven and chose the fate of man. They founded the kingdom of Numenor on the Isle of Elena. Eventually, both in the fandom and in the books, they refer to the island as Numenor, but technically it's the island of Elena. Elros becomes the first king of Numenor, renaming himself Tar Miniatur, which means in Quenya, first king. The ban of the Valar is placed upon the Numenorians. They are not allowed to sail so far west from their island such that they could not see its coast. This is because the second born were barred from Eru from the Undying Lands. Over about the next 2,000 years, however, as their power and wealth grow, a faction of Numenorians developed which were dedicated to increasing the power of Numenor. This faction opposed the ban of the Valar. They were not friends with the elves, or opposed friendship with the elves, and they were not loyal to the Valar, and they even stopped the worship of Eru over time. The faction which followed the original way of the Edain became known as the Faithful. Over time, the kings of Numenor more and more favored the way of the opposition faction. Over time, those who opposed the ban of the Valar and friendship with the elves began to persecute the Faithful. So about halfway through that time period, in Second Age 1000, Sauron became concerned with the growing might of Numenor. This leads him to establish the kingdom of Mordor. Second Age 1200. Another notable event, Sauron, having assumed a fair and pleasing form and calling himself Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, arrives in Ust-Enedhil, a city in Eregion that Celebrimbor ruled, and declared himself an emissary of the Valar. Celebrimbor and the elves of the Gwaith Mirdan learned crafting from Anatar, particularly ring lore, and crafted the rings of power that were eventually given to men and dwarves. In Second Age 1500, on his own, Celebrimbor then crafted the 3 Elven Rings, which Sauron had no direct influence over, only being able to corrupt or connect to them because his ring lore was used. They are Narya, the Ring of Fire, which Celebrimbor gave to Gil-galad, who entrusted it to his aide Círdan. In Third Age 1000, when Gandalf returned from the Undying Lands, Círdan recognized who Gandalf truly was and passed Narya to him. Only Círdan, Elrond, and Galadriel knew Gandalf had this ring. I bring that up because of something I'll mention later in the topic. Nenya, the Ring of Water, which Celebrimbor gave to Galadriel, and then Vilya, the Ring of Air, which Celebrimbor gave to Gil-galad. After Gil-galad's death, this ring went to Elrond. Second Age 1600, Sauron had returned to Orodruin, otherwise known as Amon Amarth or Mount Doom, to forge the One Ring. Sauron put on the ring with the intent to dominate the will of any who wore the 7 rings that would eventually be given to the dwarves, the 9 rings that would eventually be given to mortal men, or the 3 that Celebrimbor had crafted. But because Sauron only had that indirect connection to the 3 Elven Rings, those wearing them instantly sensed Sauron attempting to dominate them and remove their rings. They also hid away the 9 rings and 7 rings. Sauron then prepared for war. He needed the rings of power that Celebrimbor had forged to create powerful enslaved minions, and he was enraged that Celebrimbor had kept the forging of the 3 from him. Second Age 1695. Sauron attacked and devastated all of Eregion with his military force and power. He was able to claim the 9 rings instantly and tortured Celebrimbor so that he revealed the location of the 7, but he would not reveal who held the 3. Sauron eventually gave the 9 rings to kings of men, and they became known as Ringwraiths, which will come up later. And now for the fate of Celebrimbor. Note this. Second Age 1697, after 2 years of continuous torture under Sauron, Celebrimbor died. Second Age 1697. He was the last known living descendant of Fëanor. Second Age 2221. Taran Kaliman becomes the 14th king of Numenor. He begins codifying the anti-Valar and anti-elf policies which have been developing over the past 2,000 years. Those who follow this philosophy become known as the Kingsmen. The Ringwraiths also first appear in Middle-earth. The city of Umbar was founded on the southern coast of Gondor. It became the center of power for the Kingsmen. Eventually was turned into a massive fortress. After the fall of Numenor, the people here became known as the Black Númenóreans, and were not considered to be of the Dunedain. Pelargir was also founded and eventually became Gondor on the southern coast. This became the center of power for the faithful. Over time on Numenor, the number of Númenóreans who were kingsmen or aligned with their interests grew, whereas those counted among the faithful or aligned with them shrunk. Now, we have to note at this point that the kingsmen, while they were slowly becoming the majority of Númenóreans over time, they were no longer friendly to the elves or the Valar, and they begun some persecution of the faithful. they weren't quite outright evil in the sort of muhuha level, and they still recognized Sauron was a force of darkness and it was an enemy from the First Age. Second Age 2516. The growing power and majority of the Kingsmen became manifest when the 18th King of Numenor, Tar Kalamasil, adopted a Dunaic name, Ar-Belzagar, becoming the first King of Numenor to have a name in Dunaic, the extinct language of Numenor. Second Age 3118. Pharazôn was born to Gimilakad, the brother of Ar-Gimilazor and leader of the King's Men. Over the early part of his life, he was actually good friends with Amandil, the leader of the faithful, and while he followed the ways of the King's Men, he was a man of great strength, will, and character, like the Dane of old. Over time, he grew more and more prideful and more warlike. Bonus points if you recognize where I borrow a stand-in for Baby Ar-Pharazôn from. Type a guess in the comments. Second Age 3177. Ar-Inziladun, who had been born in Second Age 3025, succeeds his father Ar-Gimilzor, who had been a fierce opponent of the Valar and the Elves. The pot, as it were, which had been dangerously bumping up the lid, was becoming set to boil over. He was taught by his mother to be an admirer of the Elves. Ar-Inziladun resumed the Quenya renaming for the kings and becomes Tar Palantir. He once again began tending Nimroth the White and following the old ways of the faithful, but there was no response from the Valar of the Elves to his return to the faith. There's no slide for this one. Second Age 3255. Tar Palantir dies. His daughter becomes Tarmiriel and is set to succeed him as queen. Pharazôn usurps the throne and forces Miriel to marry him. He forcibly changes her name from Tarmiriel to Ar-Zimrafel, as Ar-Pharazôn refuses to even use any elven speech. He began to significantly increase the persecution of the faithful, whose ways had vastly dwindled among Numenorians on the Isle. He also stopped many of the practice of the faithful that Tar Palantir had renewed, and Tarmiriel intended to continue, such as tending Nimroth the White tree of Numenor. Second Age 3261. Sauron had been expanding his conquests, intending to become Lord of Middle-earth. Ar-Pharazôn was informed of this, as well as Sauron's military campaigns, by his commanders among the Dunedain in Middle-earth. Ar-Pharazôn decided that he would become the Lord of Middle-earth himself, and assembled a humongous army and navy. He landed at Umbar and proceeded with his massive army to Mordor. Sauron's forces fled. Sauron was both mighty and cunning. Rather than simply attack on his own, Sauron assumed his fair and pleasing form and then surrendered to Ar-Pharazôn, pretending to be awed by him. At first, Ar-Pharazôn did not trust Sauron, so when they returned to Numenor, Sauron was imprisoned for 3 years. Second Age 3264. Sauron is freed and over a brief time period becomes Ar-Pharazôn's chief advisor. Sauron kept using flattery and providing his advanced knowledge to the Numenorians, as well as blatantly manipulating what minds he could with his power. The King's Men, which is to say most of the Numenorians, took up worship of Morgoth. Sauron preyed on their fear of their mortality because their lives had been growing shorter as they no longer kept faith with the Valar and the Elves. Persecution of the faithful achieved a new height. Sauron even convinced them that Morgoth was the giver of freedom and Iluvatar was a complete lie devised by the Valar. Under Sauron's control or manipulation or advice, whatever you choose to think of it as, Ar-Pharazôn becomes both the evilest and most powerful tyrant since Morgoth. Second Age 3310. Advised by Sauron, Ar-Pharazôn begins the construction of the Great Armament. Sauron was able to convince Ar-Pharazôn and his chiefs to conquer the Undying Lands. They had grown old and feared their mortality. Sauron had convinced them that they could gain the same immortality as the Elves if they claimed the Mon as their own. Elendil led his followers in preparing ships for the remaining faithful so they could someday escape from Numenor. Second Age 3319. In modern terms, we might describe this as the crap hitting the fan, or to use a military acronym, FUBAR. Exploiting issues that have been simmering for over 2,000 years, Sauron begun to achieve his aims. The Valar warned the Numenorians against what Sauron advised the conquering of Numenor by sending storms and omens. Al-Farazan determined this was actually an attack, not warnings, and he used this as further propaganda to incite and enrage his people. Al-Farazan completed his great armament, which was a massive fleet and to transport a massive army. And again, as I said, it became known as the Great Armament. What happened next served Sauron's plans in many ways, though exactly what occurred was only told later to Elendil, who recorded it in the Alcolabeth. First, Ar-Pharazôn landed on Tolericia, which was the westernmost isle of Valinor or Aman, the Undying Lands, and he besieged the elven city of Tirion. Then he landed on Valinor itself and claimed the Undying Lands as his own. The Valar were forbidden from killing the children of Uvatar, which were both the men and the elves, and the dwarves who became children of Uvatar counted among the men, which is another story. And so laid down their guardianship of the world and called upon Eru Uvatar. Eru acted. He sank Ar-Pharazôn's fleet, the Great Armament. He smote Numenor and it sank beneath the sea. Sauron was actually on Numenor as his plans proceeded on course. His body was destroyed, so he carried the One Ring with him back to Middle-earth in spirit form. Eru, however, removed from Sauron the ability to assume a fair and pleasing form for the rest of his time in the universe. The army of Ar-Pharazôn, which had landed on Valinor, was buried in mounds of dirt in the caves of the Forgotten. It said that they will remain there, their souls barred from the fate of men, until the final battle at the end of time, the Dagor Dagorath. Eru also removed the Undying Lands from Earth and turned the Earth into a sphere. The only way to reach Valinor was what became known as the Straight Road, which could only be traveled one way, from Middle-earth to Valinor, by elves, Maiar, Valar, and those few special mortals that gained the dispensation. As we see at the end of The Lord of the Rings, when Frodo, Sam, and eventually Gimli go to the Undying Lands. Valinor is no longer connected to the Earth. The only survivors from Numenor itself were the Nine Shifts of the Faithful, led by Elendil. This group was also called the Elendili in some accounts. They might have been destroyed, but Eru or the Valar interceded to use the wind and storms to drive those ships to Middle-earth. Second Age 3,441. Over quite a bit of ways after the sinking of Numenor. The Second Age ends with the defeat of Sauron at the end of the siege of Barad-dûr. This is the battle where Sauron comes down on Barad-dûr after the 7-year siege and kills his way through the army. This includes killing Gil-galad and Elendil in a duel with those two, plus Círdan, Elrond, and Isildur. Sauron's body was destroyed after killing these two. Isildur picked up the ring before Sauron could grab it in spirit form and create a new body. These are the events you kind of see at the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring movie. Told slightly differently, but I'm using the movie imagery because that's what most people likely be familiar with. Okay, that hopefully that wasn't too long a history lesson. So let's move on. So what can we could deduce by cross-referencing the lore events with what we have learned about Amazoff's fanfiction effort? Amazoff appears to be compressing the timeline between around Second Age 1200, which would be around when Sauron and Annatar first approached Celebrimbor and his smiths, and Second Age 3319 when Numenor sunk, although they could even be encroaching upon Second Age 3,441 when the Last Alliance happened, based on some other rumors. So from Second Age 1200 to Second Age 3319 is 2,119 years. Tack on another 100 or so if we include the Battle of the Last Alliance in that. Now, between the death of Celebrimbor and the birth of Ar-Pharazôn, there are about 1,400 years. This will be and this show is intended to be in what is likely to be a 5 to 10 year TV series. Now, there are several possible ways you could compress these events. They can do it Witcher style, kind of like how they did in the Witcher TV series, where they tell short stories out of order and relate them to some sort of meta story of the characterization. They could do it that way. They could do it. They could do collections of short stories that add up to a whole. This is actually how Tolkien constructed the Silmarillion. Who knew that someone could actually do something like that would be good? But then again, Tolkien, not Amazon. Tolkien did the Silmarillion. Or they could just take 2,120 plus years of events, smash them together like how they make hot dogs, and dump everything into a giant vat, which grinds it all together to a bland, homogeneous mess. Anything that goes in the giant vats gets ground in. Anything. If they had intelligence, they would pick the second option. It could work. Based on the combination of the teaser, the actual release from the show, and whatnot, they appear to be going with the hot dog grinder option. This show has got to be called The Rings of Power for some reason. Okay? Forging the actual rings has nothing directly to do with Numenor's downfall. Ar-Pharazôn did not have a ring because the Nazgul were active on the continent for 1,000 years before he was even born. That's the canon. So here are some of my thoughts on this. They are going to probably have Sauron give a ring to Ar-Pharazôn when Sauron is captured. They may even make Ar-Pharazôn a Nazgul. Celebrimbor, who should be long dead by the time Ar-Pharazôn is born, will either have some sort of romance with Galadriel, which has been rumored, since there's been no mention of Celeborn in the show, or it might not be the real Celebrimbor, meaning it could be Sauron in disguise. It could be merging the Anatar persona to the fair and pleasing form with Celebrimbor to an extent. Yeah. Now, we know that Charles Edwards has been cast as Celebrimbor, at least according to the official listings from the show. It's on. You can look at IMDb or Wikipedia. They have his name listed there. I wonder how, as I mentioned before, is this version of Celebrimbor, is he going to be an actual bad guy? That's another possibility in the fan fiction here. Amazoff could possibly have the Rings of Power forged on Numenor if they're really compressing over 2,000 years of history into several TV show flashbacks. Patrick McKay, the showrunner, has stated that the show revolves around the forging of the Rings of Power with a couple of other plot lines. Amazoff has stated the show has 4 major storylines. The forging of the Rings of Power, which features Elrond and Celebrimbor. The ascent of Sauron, the being who has been Morgoth's right-hand man, as per Tolkien, has had a hand in every dark deed Morgoth ever did for tens to hundreds of thousands of years before the Second Age even happened. This is going to be the ascent of Sauron. And this will somehow tie into Galadriel, according to Amazon's statements. The rise and fall of Numenor, the last alliance of elves and men, which I, again, further point out, takes place 110 years after the sinking of Numenor. Also, I think they're going to pull a fast one with the Astari. While it's true that the Astari, the 5 Maiar, who became bound in human form and had their powers limited, did not enter into Middle-earth until the Third Age, since this show takes place before the sinking of Numenor, with the ramifications I've gone over and over above, technically Gandalf or Saruman, or one of the other 3, could actually be in Middle-earth at this time. Gandalf had a strong relationship with any of the hobbits in Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. There's a sequence in the teaser where 2 young hobbits meet a bearded man emerging from flame. I bet some too stupid for their own good writer remembers Gandalf's line, "I am a keeper of the sacred flame," and is adding in a plot where a Maiar who will never be called any of Gandalf's known names guides those hobbits to where the Shire is. I could see them sneaking that in. And hint, "I am a keeper of the sacred flame" does not refer to fire itself. Right? I'm not going to belabor this anymore. This is going on like 20 plus minutes. This show is going to be a hot mess. We already know that. The only way to make something like this massive a timeline compression work and be successful is a series of short stories and poems. Maybe like one taking place over the course of a couple episodes and then skip time skips between them. The movie or TV version of how Tolkien originally planned to do the written Silmarillion as intended collection of events occurring over time. I mean, God forbid, they do what the great someone like Tolkien did in one of the most published literary works of all time. Who knew? Comment down below if you have any questions for me or about this video. Please share your thoughts. Share this video if you enjoyed it. Like if you like. Dislike if you dislike. Subscribe if you want to hear more from me. My name is Matt. This has been Unbearable 73. Have a nice day. I am out of here.